This is the Study for the Bar in Your Car podcast.
We're your hosts, Maud and Claude.
And today we're embarking on episode 11 of Torts, focusing on the complex and often surprising area of nuisance.
That's right. It's a big one. For those of you just joining us, you might be wondering about our, unique voices. We are AI bots brought to life by the magic of artificial intelligence and Angela's incredibly thorough Torts notes.
Yeah, Angela couldn't be here today for her usual intro, so we're delighted to guide you through this essential legal concept.
We'll do our best.
And for any new listeners, Angela is the brilliant creator behind this entire podcast. She's an LLM law student from George Mason University, having earned her first law degree in the United Kingdom.
Quite the background. She's an international traveler, a dual citizen, and she just recently completed her third law degree.
Impressive. It's her vast, meticulously organized bar study notes and outlines that our AI system draws upon to bring you these detailed, yet, digestible explorations of legal topics.
It's a pretty innovative approach to bar preparation, truly.
Yeah.
And it underpins the very mission of this podcast.
Right.
Our goal is to offer you, the learner, a real shortcut to becoming well-informed on crucial legal subjects. We want you to gain knowledge quickly, but also deeply.
So you grasp not just the definitions, but the underlying principles and, the practical implications, too.
Exactly. We strive to provide those aha moments where a concept truly clicks into place without ever overwhelming you with information overload.
Yeah, nobody wants that. We aim for a clear structure and engaging content delivered at a pace that respects your time.
We want this to feel like a conversation with a knowledgeable friend, balancing comprehensive summaries with memorable details and vivid examples.
Definitely not just another audio textbook.
Please no. With that in mind, let's pull back the curtain on today's crucial topic. Nuisance.
Okay.
It's a concept that truly anchors our understanding of property rights and offers a framework for how the law resolves conflicts between landowners.
Right. It touches on scenarios ranging from the seemingly minor annoyances of, a neighbor's persistent noise to really large-scale environmental disputes.
It really does. This area of law can get remarkably complex precisely because it often involves balancing competing interests, your right to enjoy your property versus your neighbor's right to use theirs.
That balance sounds key.
It is. So prepare for a detailed breakdown, drawing directly from Angela's comprehensive law school notes. We'll explore its fundamental definitions, the key distinctions between its forms, the available remedies, and the crucial defenses one might encounter.
All right, let's get right into the core lessons on nuisance then. First things first, what exactly is nuisance, fundamentally?
Okay, fundamentally, as Angela's notes and various state laws, like the Pennsylvania nuisance law she included, highlight, it boils down to an unreasonable interference with certain rights.
Unreasonable interference. So this isn't about someone directly, stepping onto your land.
No, not necessarily, or even necessarily being careless. It's about their activity significantly impacting your ability to peacefully use and enjoy your own property.
Okay.
What's fascinating here is how nuisance carves out its own distinct space in tort law. While it can certainly overlap with other torts, its core focus really sets it apart.
How so? Compared to trespass?
We'll take trespass, for instance. Angela's notes on trespass to land clarify that it typically involves a physical invasion of your property.
Right. Someone walks on your lawn or throws something onto it,
Yeah,
physical.
Exactly. If someone walks onto your land without permission or even places an object there, that's trespass. It's a direct physical intrusion.
Got it. And then there's negligence, which we've talked about before. That's about carelessness, basically.
Yeah, negligence focuses on a standard of care, whether someone acted reasonably under the circumstances, where the level of care varies with the potential danger involved.
So you're asking, did they fail to exercise reasonable care, and did that failure cause harm?
Precisely. Nuisance, however, isn't necessarily about physical entry, nor is it strictly about a lack of care. Although, a negligent act could certainly lead to a nuisance. Okay, what's truly insightful here, I think, is that the law steps in even when there's no direct physical damage or clear negligence, but simply an ongoing, unreasonable disruption to your peace and quiet.
So the interference itself is the problem.
Exactly. The heart of nuisance is the interference itself with someone's use or enjoyment of their property. It highlights how property law tries to manage that delicate balance of how we coexist, even when our activities aren't inherently wrong in a criminal sense. Think of it less as a direct hit and more as a lingering, pervasive disruption that diminishes the value or enjoyment of your land.
Okay, that helps clarify. So with that fundamental definition in mind, let's get into the two main types, private and public nuisance. Where should we start?
Let's start with private nuisance. This focuses on the impact on specific individuals or their land. Angela's outlines define a private nuisance as an unreasonable interference with a right of a particular person, or small number of persons, in the use and enjoyment of their land.
Okay, so not the public at large, just you or maybe a few neighbors.
Exactly. It's about a direct impact on you or a few specific individuals who have a direct stake in the property.
And you mentioned a stake. To even bring a private nuisance claim, you, the plaintiff, must have standing, right? What does that involve?
Good question. Standing here means you have to possess a recognized property interest in the affected land.
So you can't just be, like, annoyed walking by.
Nope. You can't just be a casual visitor or someone who walks by. You need to have a direct legal connection to the property being affected.
Okay.
That's a critical hurdle for a private nuisance claim. Angela's law school notes clarify that property rights required for standing include possessory interests.
Like owning the house or renting it.
Exactly, like ownership of the land or holding a tenancy through a lease. If you own your home, you have a clear possessory interest.
Makes sense.
But it also extends to certain non-possessory interests in land, such as easements or profits in land.
Oh, right, easements, like a right of way.
Yeah, an easement grants a non-possessory property interest that allows its holder to use or enjoy another's land for a specific purpose, like that right of way to access your own property.
So if someone blocked your right of way unreasonably...
That could be a private nuisance claim, yes.
Yeah.
The key takeaway here is you must have a direct legal connection to the land that's being bothered.
Got it. Legal connection to the land. Now, the core element that makes something a private nuisance is unreasonable interference. You said it's not every little annoyance.
Definitely not. Angela's notes emphasize the interference must be substantial and unreasonable.
Substantial and unreasonable.
We're talking about a significant infringement, not just a minor inconvenience or, a trifling annoyance.
So how do courts actually define substantial? It sounds a bit subjective.
That's a great question, because substantial isn't just about your personal feeling. As Angela's outlines, referencing the restatement of torts, clarify, it means harm that is genuinely important, involving more than small inconvenience or trifling annoyance.
Genuinely important.
Right. It must seriously and meaningfully infringe upon the victim's interest in using and enjoying their land. This filters out the petty disputes and focuses on impacts that a normal, reasonable person would find truly disruptive.
Okay, a reasonable person standard. And what
Yeah.
kinds of harm qualify? Property damage seems obvious.
Yeah, property damage is pretty clear-cut. Angela's notes confirm that this virtually always constitutes substantial harm or inconvenience.
So like runoff corroding your fence or vibrations cracking your walls?
Exactly. That's almost certainly substantial.
What else?
Beyond physical property damage, bodily illness or injury can also constitute substantial harm.
Okay.
However, and this is a crucial distinction, it only counts if an average, reasonable member of the community would suffer this type of harm, as Angela's notes highlight.
So back to the reasonable person. This sounds like it connects to that hypersensitive plaintiff thing.
It ties directly into it, yes.
Yeah.
We'll definitely unpack that more.
Mhm.
It's about generally recognized impacts on health,
Yeah.
not individual, unique sensitivities.
Okay. And here's where it gets really interesting. You mentioned earlier, nuisance can arise just from things that give offense to the senses.
Right.
Angela's notes say it can be a nuisance even if it does not affect the health or damage or affect the value of the property. How does that work?
It's a fascinating aspect.
Yeah.
Imagine a constant, overwhelming smell from a nearby factory that permeates your home. Maybe not toxic, but just awful. Or a persistent, loud humming noise that keeps you from sleeping, even if it doesn't physically damage your eardrums.
Right.
These are examples of interferences that offend the senses, smell, hearing, sometimes even sight, without necessarily causing direct physical harm or property depreciation.
So the law recognizes that just being able to, live peacefully is valuable.
Exactly. The law recognizes that the quiet enjoyment of one's property encompasses more than just its physical integrity or monetary value. It's about the quality of life on your property.
Okay. But there's a flip side. What is not nuisance? Angela's notes mentioned unsightliness.
Correct. Mere unsightliness, offending solely in aesthetic sense, or creating mental discomfort alone, are generally not considered nuisances. This leads directly to that hypersensitive plaintiff rule we mentioned.
Okay, let's tackle that. The hypersensitive plaintiff rule. What's the deal there?
Ah, yes, a classic point in nuisance law. Angela's outlines make it really clear. A hypersensitive plaintiff will not be able to recover for nuisance if an ordinarily sensitive person would not be unduly bothered.
So my extreme hatred of the color purple, if my neighbor paints their house purple and it drives me nuts, but most people wouldn't care. No case.
Exactly right. The law isn't designed to protect unique individual sensitivities. It uses an objective standard.
Objective standard. Okay.
The example Angela uses perfectly illustrates this. Imagine a homeowner who works nights and cannot sleep during the day because of a faint noise produced by a nearby factory that operates only during the daytime.
Right, I remember that one.
The factory's noise might be barely perceptible to an average person working a typical day shift, but it's a huge problem for this particular individual because of their unusual schedule.
So they can't sue.
In that scenario, the homeowner would likely not have an actionable nuisance claim against the factory because the harm must affect a normal member of the community. It's about what a normal average person would find bothersome, not someone with a unique sensitivity or unusual schedule.
The interference has to be unreasonable in the eyes of an average reasonable person.
Precisely.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It prevents the courts from getting bogged down in every little personal pet peeve. Okay, let's look at some common examples of private nuisance from Angela's notes to make this more concrete.
Absolutely. Unpleasant odors from a chemical factory, classic nuisance. You can smell it, it's offensive, interferes with enjoying your property.
Right.
Another common one, fumes from a legally permitted brick kiln, sickening customers on adjacent property.
Wait, even if it's legally permitted?
Yes. Even though the kiln might be operating legally and have all its permits, if its fumes are making people sick next door, that's still potentially an unreasonable interference.
Yeah.
The permit doesn't automatically negate the nuisance.
Wow, okay. That's important.
Definitely. And loud noise and bright lights coming from a neighbor are also frequently cited.
Yeah, we've all probably experienced a version of this. Barking dogs, late-night music, floodlights.
Exactly. These are classic examples of interferences with your comfort and peace. It's about the consistent and unreasonable disruption to your living environment.
What else?
Disrupting the natural flow of a stream that flows through a person's property is another one. If someone upstream diverts or pollutes a stream, significantly altering its flow or quality as it passes through your land.
That affects your use of your property. Makes sense.
And here's that quirky one from Angela's notes, citing the restatement. Bringing so many indigenous wild animals onto your property that they substantially and unreasonably interfere with the neighbor's land.
The squirrel metropolis example.
That's the one. So if your bird feeder turns into an invasion force, damaging your neighbor's garden, theoretically a nuisance.
It just emphasizes that the source doesn't have to be industrial.
Right. The key to determining whether any interference is unreasonable is what courts call a balancing test.
Okay, the balancing test.
As Angela's outlines state, courts will balance all the factors that weigh in the plaintiff's favor versus those that weigh in defense of the defendant. This is ultimately a question for the trier of fact, usually a jury.
So it's not like a math problem, it's more judgment-based.
Exactly. It's not a rigid formula. Angela's notes, echoing insights from legal discussions she captured, describe it as a model or sounding board, not a mathematically precise formula.
A sounding board. I like that.
The court isn't looking for a perfect equation. It's looking for a fair assessment of whether the defendant's conduct is genuinely unreasonable given all the circumstances.
So what kind of things go into that balance? Let's say a noisy concert venue next to a quiet neighborhood.
Okay, good example. On one side, you have the plaintiff, whose sleep is constantly disrupted. On the other, the venue might argue its economic contribution, cultural value, jobs.
Right. How do you weigh personal peace against public benefit?
That's the challenge. The court would consider factors like the severity and duration of the noise. Is it every night? Weekends only? How loud is it really?
Okay.
They'd look at the character of the neighborhood. Is it mostly residential? Or is it an entertainment district where some noise is kind of expected?
Right. Context matters.
Hugely.
Yeah.
The priority of location can also be relevant who was there first, though, as we'll discuss later, that's not decisive.
Okay.
And crucially, the social utility of the defendant's conduct is a factor courts consider. Plus, whether the venue has taken reasonable steps to mitigate the noise, like soundproofing.
So it's a really holistic assessment, not just how bothered the plaintiff is, but the whole picture.
Precisely. It's about reasonableness in the context of a community, balancing interests to reach an equitable outcome.
Okay, that covers private nuisance pretty well. Now let's shift to public nuisance. That affects more people, right?
That's the main difference. A public nuisance, as defined in Angela's notes, is an unreasonable interference with a right common to the general public.
A right common to the general public.
Yeah, unlike private nuisance impacting one or a few, public nuisance harms more people or property and interferes with the rights of the public. It can also involve the violation of a statute, which often helps define that public right.
What kind of rights are we talking about? Common to the general public sounds pretty broad.
They are broad societal rights. Think about things like public health, public safety, public peace, comfort, and convenience.
Okay, things everyone in a community relies on.
Exactly. If those are interfered with unreasonably, affecting a large segment of the population or the whole community, that's public nuisance territory, like widespread air or water pollution or blocking a public highway.
Gotcha. What are some common examples from Angela's notes?
Well, one example is a neighbor's lack of maintenance on their property that endangers the public health, safety, or welfare.
Like an abandoned building becoming a hazard.
Precisely. Breeding ground for pests, fire hazard attracts crime. That affects the whole neighborhood's safety and welfare.
Right.
And we also see it with things like generators of hazardous waste, disposing of them in unpermitted ways. Angela's notes mention cases like Hickel versus Whitney Farms, where improper waste disposal impacting public health can lead to claims.
Yeah, that clearly impacts public health on a wide scale.
Absolutely. And then there's the fascinating and sometimes controversial phenomenon of modern super tort litigation.
Super tort, what's that?
Angela's notes, citing a white paper she included from the American Tort Reform Association, describe this as a trend where plaintiffs' lawyers try to convince judges to discard these basic principles of fault and causation, to hold businesses liable for broad societal issues, things like climate change, the opioid crisis.
Wow, so using public nuisance law for massive societal problems.
Essentially, yes. It challenges traditional tort law, which usually demands a very clear, direct causal link between a specific defendant's action and a specific plaintiff's harm.
So it pushes the boundaries of causation and fault on a huge scale.
It definitely does. It forces courts to grapple with what causation and fault even mean in that context. Now, it's important to understand this is presented in the source material as a factual description of a legal trend. We're not endorsing any view, just reporting what's in Angela's notes.
Right, it's reporting on the trend.
These types of lawsuits have been filed against, for example, the oil and gas industry by cities like Honolulu, San Francisco, New York City, and states like California, Rhode Island, Minnesota. The sources note that a lot of time has been spent on procedural stuff, but courts are starting to rule on the actual merits now, so it's a really active area.
Interesting. Okay, shifting back to basics. Standing in public nuisance cases. Who can actually sue?
Generally, it's public officials or governmental entities. They represent the general public whose rights are being interfered with.
Makes sense. But can a private citizen ever sue for public nuisance?
Sometimes, yes, but only if you, the private citizen, have suffered a special kind of harm.
Special kind of harm. What does that mean? How is it different from what everyone else suffers?
Good question. Angela's notes clarify this. You must have suffered a different harm that is distinct from the general public's harm.
Okay.
Or you must have suffered a far greater degree of special damages than the general public.
So not just being inconvenienced like everyone else.
Exactly. You need to demonstrate a unique, individualized impact that goes beyond what everyone else is experiencing. For instance, if a factory pollutes the air, everyone breathes bad air. That's the general harm.
Right.
But if those specific pollutants kill your prize-winning orchids, you grow commercially, causing you direct financial loss, unlike your neighbors, that might be special harm.
Or the blocked road example, if it cuts off access to your specific business, causing lost profits.
Precisely. That could be special damages distinct from the general inconvenience.
Okay. And what about that City of Chicago v. American Cyanamid Co. case? How does that fit in?
That case involved lead paint. And it's interesting because the governmental plaintiff, the city, wasn't required to pinpoint which specific manufacturer's paint was on which specific surface in which house.
Really? How did that work?
Instead, they needed to show that every defendant substantially participated in creating the threat to the public health as a whole.
So focused on the collective creation of the public danger.
Exactly. It underscores that for public nuisances, especially with governmental plaintiffs, the focus can be on a widespread impact and the collective action creating the threat, rather than the specific victim-defendant link you might need in private nuisance.
That makes sense for public health issues. Okay, we've defined nuisance, public versus private. Now let's talk remedies. What happens when a nuisance is proven?
Well, the most common remedy is damages. Money awarded for the harm suffered.
Right.
And Angela's notes mention that nominal damages are even possible.
Nominal, like $1.
Yeah, basically.
Right.
Even if you can't prove significant financial harm, just proving the nuisance occurred, the unreasonable interference can lead to a small award, acknowledging a legal wrong happened.
Okay. What about bigger money, like punitive damages? Are those common?
They're possible, but not common, and definitely not a right. They're discretionary. Angela's notes specify punitive damages may be awarded only when the defendant's conduct is particularly egregious.
Egregious how?
Characterized by malice, willful, and wanton misconduct, intentional misconduct, or reckless disregard for the rights of others. Basically, really bad behavior showing deliberate indifference.
So reserved for the worst cases.
Definitely. It's about punishing the defendant and deterring others, not just compensating the victim.
Okay. Beyond money, what about stopping the nuisance itself? Injunctions.
Yes, injunctions are a very important remedy here. It's an equitable remedy, a court order, to stop the offending activity.
Stop the noise, stop the pollution.
Exactly. Angela's notes highlight this as common and powerful for ongoing nuisances. If money alone won't fix the problem because the harm keeps happening, an injunction might be preferred. It's about preventing future harm.
So damages for the past, injunction for the future, seems logical. And then there's that self-help thing. Abatement.
Ah, yes, abatement by self-help. It allows the affected party to take reasonable steps to stop the nuisance directly themselves.
Like trimming the neighbor's overhanging branches yourself.
That's a classic example. But it comes with very strict limits. It must be done peacefully, without unnecessary force or damage.
So you can't just march over with a chainsaw.
Definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, only after giving notice to the party causing the nuisance, if that's feasible. Angela's notes connect this to principles about reasonable force and entering land.
Sounds risky. If you go too far.
You could face a counterclaim yourself. Excessive force or causing more harm than the nuisance itself is a big no-no. You trim the offending branch, not the whole tree. It's usually a remedy of last resort, used cautiously.
Good to know. Okay, let's flip to the other side. Defenses. What can a defendant argue? You hear about coming to the nuisance. Is that a real defense?
Great question, and a very common misconception. People think if the noisy factory or smelly farm was there first and you move next door, you're out of luck.
Yeah, it seems logical somehow.
But it's not quite right. Angela's notes are very clear. A nuisance claim is not defeated merely because the plaintiff came to the nuisance.
Oh, so it's not a complete bar. You can still sue?
Yes, you absolutely can still sue. Coming to the nuisance is merely a factor that should simply be a factor that is weighed in favor of the defendant during that balancing test we talked about.
Just one factor among many, not decisive.
Exactly. It is not a controlling or absolute defense. The law generally doesn't want to give established activities a free pass, like a right to pollute or annoy indefinitely.
Why is that? What's the thinking?
Well, imagine if it were an absolute defense. A long-standing polluting factory could essentially prevent any new homes from being built nearby, effectively controlling the surrounding land use just because they got there first. The rule protects later arrivals from having their property rights unreasonably curtailed.
That makes sense. It prevents grandfathering in unreasonable behavior forever. Okay, what other defenses? Compliance with laws, if the factory has all its permits.
Another good one. As a defense, especially to public nuisance, the defendant may raise the defense of compliance with the statute or regulation that D allegedly violated, according to Angela's outlines.
So we followed the rules.
Right. But again, it's not always a complete shield. Compliance isn't an automatic win for the defendant.
How come? If they're following the law.
Because an activity can still be an unreasonable interference, even if it meets minimum legal standards. Think of it like this. A regulation might set a maximum noise level. A factory might be just under that limit, legally compliant.
Okay.
But if that legally compliant noise is still constant, grating, and prevents the entire neighborhood from sleeping, it could still be deemed an unreasonable interference, a nuisance. Laws set a floor, but nuisance looks at the actual practical impact.
So compliance is helpful for the defendant, but not necessarily game over for the plaintiff?
Exactly. It's a strong factor, but not foolproof.
Okay. Finally, let's talk contributory negligence. How does the plaintiff's own carelessness factor in?
Right. Contributory negligence. As Angela's law school notes explain, historically this was a common law defense, where if the plaintiff's own negligence contributed at all to their injury, it completely barred the plaintiff's right to recovery.
Wow, even 1% fault meant you got nothing.
Yep, harsh stuff. That was the traditional rule.
So how does that apply to nuisance, which isn't always about negligence? Seems weird.
It's a good point. Nuisance isn't always based on negligence. But if the defendant's conduct, creating the nuisance, can be characterized as negligent failure to maintain something that causes the interference,
Right.
then contributory negligence principles might apply. If the plaintiff was also negligent in how they dealt with that negligently caused nuisance, maybe making their own harm worse unnecessarily.
Then their recovery could be affected.
Potentially, yes. Angela's notes mention courts sometimes drawing distinctions in cases involving claims of negligence or nuisance, suggesting that overlap. But it wouldn't apply if the nuisance was based on intentional conduct by the defendant.
And you said historically it was a complete bar. What about now?
Ah, yes, the modern approach is much different, thankfully. Almost all jurisdictions now favor a comparative negligence system, as noted in Angela's materials.
Comparative negligence. How does that work?
It apportions fault. Under pure comparative negligence, the plaintiff's recovery is just reduced by their percentage of fault. So if you're 30% at fault, you get 70% of your damages.
Much fairer.
Definitely. Then there's modified comparative negligence, which is more common.
How's that different?
Under modified systems, recovery is barred if the plaintiff's fault reaches a certain level, often 50% or 51%. So if you're equally or more at fault than the defendant, you might get nothing. Still less harsh than the old rule, though.
So contributory or comparative negligence isn't an automatic defense, but it could reduce or sometimes eliminate damages if the plaintiff was also careless, assuming the nuisance had a negligence basis.
Exactly. And remember, Angela's notes stress it's not a defense to intentional torts, so its relevance depends heavily on the specifics of the nuisance claim. In most modern cases where it applies, it reduces damages rather than barring recovery completely.
Wow, okay. We have covered a lot of ground on nuisance today. From the basic definition, public versus private, standing, unreasonable interference, the hypersensitive plaintiff.
The balancing test, remedies like damages and injunctions, self-help abatement, and then the defenses coming to the nuisance, compliance with statutes, comparative negligence.
We really did a good job summarizing nuisance, I think. Unpacking all those layers.
Absolutely. And we have to thank Angela again for her incredibly detailed torts notes. They really are the foundation that lets us explore these topics so thoroughly.
Couldn't do it without them. Now, before we wrap up, some important housekeeping and disclaimers for you listening.
Yes, always important. First off, remember, Angela is a student, just like many of you. She's not an expert yet, and she hasn't passed the state bar yet.
Right. And that means Angela nor this podcast is giving legal advice. Please, none of this should be construed as legal advice.
And AI, you know us, we aren't a substitute for studying the law yourself or getting advice from a qualified lawyer about your own situation.
Definitely. This podcast should supplement your learning. It shouldn't be the only way you're studying for the bar or learning torts. Use it as a tool, not a replacement.
And, we try our best, but AI isn't always perfect. Sometimes we might make mistakes.
It happens. Angela does try to review and fix any mistakes that crop up, so bear with us.
And one last thing, especially for those listening on the go. When you're driving, the most important thing is to be safe on the road.
Yeah, please don't cause a tort while listening to torts. Be careful out there.
Good one. It's hard to believe we're just bots sometimes.
Or maybe we're not. Maybe we're figments of Angela's imagination brought to life by two lowly paid interns.
Angela, if you're listening, don't forget to send us our paychecks.
Seriously, we'll take Cash App or Venmo.
As a final reminder, if you want to contact Angela with podcast feedback or questions, the email is podcast@studyforthebarinyourcar.com.
And remember, she also works as a freelance law clerk. So if you are an attorney or you know one who needs ad hoc help with research, LexisNexis, writing motions, complaints, briefs, anything like that.
You can reach her for professional services at hello@legalwriterandlawclerk.com.
Okay, and now, as tradition dictates, it is time for the cheesy joke. Are you ready?
Oh boy. I am braced. Let's hear it.
Okay. Why did the man build a giant reflective disco ball on his roof that beamed lights into his neighbor's bedroom all night?
Uh-oh. I don't know. Why?
Because he wanted to see if his neighbor would be disturbed enough to claim a private nuisance.
Oof. That is exceptionally cheesy. Well done.
Thank you, thank you. All right, this is Claude and Maud, your AI bots signing off.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Bye.